Bold statement here, but if you never read the books, then I'm not sure you understand Voldemort's character as well as you might think. Because interestingly, despite Voldemort being the primary antagonist in the books and films, as well as arguably the second most important character, next to Harry of course, a lot of his origin story actually never made it onto the big screen. Sure, we get some bits and pieces as the films progress, and we get a few flashbacks in the Half-Blood Prince, but honestly, if I hadn't read the books, I really don't think that I would have properly understood many of the key components that relate back to his family. In the Half-Blood Prince novel especially, Dumbledore spends a significant amount of time guiding Harry through Tom Riddle's past using Pensieve memories. They're the blueprint for understanding Voldemort, how he thinks, what he values, and why he made the choices he did. But in the movie adaptation, most of these memories never appear. Take the Gaunt ring, for example. In the films, the ring almost feels incidental. It appears, it's cursed, and then it's gone. If you haven't read the books, it's never really properly explained whose ring it was, where it came from, or why Voldemort would consider it worthy of housing a piece of his soul. The films imply its importance, but never explain it, and I think the only reason I was able to fill in those gaps in the first place is because I read the books. And it's not just the ring. Entire Pensieve memories were removed. The Ministry visit to the Gaunt Shack, the theft of the locket, the framing of Morphin, the Hepzibah Smith murder, the connective tissue that makes Voldemort make sense. There's also Voldemort's mother, who is barely acknowledged, despite being central to understanding his earliest years. Her absence leaves a huge gap, especially when it comes to questions about Voldemort's ability to feel love, and whether that absence was something he was born with, or something that was shaped. Even young Tom Riddle himself is left somewhat undefined. We see flashes of him as a strange and unsettling child, but much of what made those early years so disturbing is either softened or omitted entirely. Enough is shown to tell us he's different, but not enough to fully explain how early that darkness began. It's never explained why he's so obsessed with immortality. And then there are the Horcruxes. The films show us what they are and how they're destroyed, but rarely why those specific objects were chosen, or what they meant to Voldemort on a personal level. Without that context, a lot of the Horcruxes felt a bit arbitrary, when in reality they were carefully chosen. Individually, these missing details might not seem all that important, but taken together, they fundamentally change how you understand Voldemort, not just as a villain, but as a character. And as a result, movie-only viewers are left with a version of Voldemort that feels powerful, but oddly incomplete. You're told he fears death, but not why that fear is so consuming. You're shown his Horcruxes, but not why he chose those specific objects. You're shown his cruelty, but not how early or how deliberately it began. Which brings us to the biggest question. Why? Why make the decision to omit the backstory of one of the most enigmatic and most importantly key characters from the series? Today I'm going to fill in the missing pieces by telling the story of Lord Voldemort, finally exploring his dark origins and taking a closer look at why the films may have chosen to leave them behind. Hey everyone, welcome to another installment of Harry Potter Theory. Before we can begin to unravel the tale of Lord Voldemort, we first need to understand the family he came from, the House of Gaunt. The Gaunts have a long dark history, with known details of the family tracing back as far as the 1600s. At one time they were wealthy and prominent, a prosperous wizarding family that reaped the benefits of being present during the early formation of the wizarding world as we know it. As direct descendants of Salazar Slytherin, they took immense pride in their lineage and pure blood status. But over time, the Gaunts became poorer, more inbred, and quite frankly, a disaster in whichever way you looked at them. Obsessed with preserving their bloodline at all costs, the family repeatedly married within itself, leading to severe mental instability and social isolation. Their arrogance remained, but their influence, wealth, and standing within the wizarding world steadily eroded. By the early 20th century, the once proud Gaunt family had been reduced to living in a small, run-down shack just outside the Muggle village of Little Hangleton, engulfed in poverty and obscurity. They were feared by the local Muggles, shunned by the wider wizarding community, and known more for their cruelty than their legacy. And it was into this environment that Merope Gaunt, Voldemort's mother, was born. Born in 1907, Merope entered a family already in complete decline. She grew up in Little Hangleton, sharing the Gaunt household with her father, Marvolo, and her brother, Morphin. And from the moment she was born, Merope faced a deeply troubled existence, constantly berated and abused by both her father and her brother, treated as weak, worthless, and a disappointment to the Gaunt name. Unlike the rest of her family, Merope showed little aptitude for magic early on, something that only worsened the abuse she suffered. However, in adulthood, Merope finally found herself alone for the first time. This followed an altercation involving her father, her brother, and the Ministry of Magic, an event that would temporarily remove them from her life and leave Merope completely on her own. You see, Morphin Gaunt was mentally deranged and took pleasure in using magic on muggles, something that repeatedly brought the Gaunt family to the attention of the Ministry of Magic. In the books, this is shown through a Pensieve memory examined by Dumbledore, one that never made it into the films. In that memory, following a violent attack on a group of muggles in Little Hangleton, a ministry official named Bob Ogden from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement is dispatched to investigate the Gaunts. And what Ogden encounters at the Gaunt Shack is absolute chaos. Morphin is openly hostile, boasting about attacking muggles, while Marvolo Gaunt attempts to intimidate Ogden by speaking Parseltongue and brandishing the family's ancestral heirlooms. Throughout the encounter, Merope cowers in silence, clearly terrified of both her father and her brother. All of this is covered in Chapter 10 of The Half-Blood Prince. During the confrontation, Morphin mockingly reveals Merope's romantic interest in a local muggle, a confession that sends Marvolo into a rage. Enraged by the idea that his daughter had feelings for someone he considered beneath them, Marvolo immediately turns on Merope and attacks her. Ogden attempts to intervene and protect her, but this only escalates the situation further, prompting Morphin to violently assault the ministry official. The incident spirals out of control and ultimately results in both Gaunt men being arrested and sent to Azkaban, Marvolo for 6 months and Morphin for 3 years. Later, Dumbledore reveals another crucial Pensieve memory, one that directly exposes Voldemort's early capacity for manipulation and deception, and one that was also completely removed from the films. In it, Morphin proudly confesses to the murder of the Riddle family, boasting about killing the muggles who lived in the grand house overlooking Little Hangleton. He even claims the act as revenge for his sister's disgrace. And while at first glance the confession seems genuine, Dumbledore quickly realizes that something is wrong. The memory has been tampered with. Morphin's recollection is fragmented and inconsistent, and upon closer examination, Dumbledore determines that Morphin was not the true murderer at all. In reality, it was Tom Riddle who committed the murders. Voldemort had stunned Morphin, stolen the Gaunt family ring, modified Morphin's memory, and framed him for the crime. By cutting this memory, the films remove one of the clearest examples of Voldemort's methodical intelligence, the proof that he wasn't just violent or cruel, but calculating, patient, and frighteningly thorough. But before Tom Riddle was even born, and after Marvolo and Morphin had been imprisoned, Merope Gaunt found herself alone for the first time in her life. And in that isolation, something changed. Freed from the constant torment of her father and brother, Merope was finally able to access her magical abilities that had long been suppressed. With that newfound freedom, it didn't take long for her magic to flourish. However, these newfound magical abilities eventually manifested in the form of a love potion, also known as Amortentia. Amortentia is considered by some to be the most dangerous potion in the Harry Potter universe, as it doesn't even induce actual love, just a semblance of love that is derived from strong obsession. The potion can truly make people do some very uncharacteristically strange things. And what did Merope do with this love potion? Why, use it on the wealthy, handsome muggle Tom Riddle Sr., of course. It's unknown how exactly Merope gave Riddle the love potion, as their lives weren't particularly intertwined. But we do know that he fell under its spell, quickly becoming infatuated with Merope. Fast forward just a few months later, and the two were married, with Merope pregnant with their child, Tom Marvolo Riddle, the same child that would later go on to become Lord Voldemort. But this love affair didn't last long, as little less than a year after that, the effects of the spell no longer seemed to be influencing Tom. He began to fall out of love. It's unclear why this may have happened, but there are a few prevailing theories. The first is that Merope perpetuated her brainwashing of Tom via the Imperious Curse, and that she eventually stopped because she was curious as to whether he may have genuinely fallen in love with her. The second is that the effects of the love potion simply wore off. However, regardless of what may have happened, the day came where Tom was no longer bewitched, and it didn't take long for him to abandon his wife and unborn child, promptly heading back to the town of Little Hangleton. After Tom fled, Merope succumbed to a profound depression and completely ceased practicing magic. And on New Year's Eve in 1926, she went to an orphanage and gave birth to her son, Tom Marvolo Riddle. Tom for the boy's father, and Marvolo for Merope's father. Tragically, Merope died shortly after Riddle was born, the result of a broken heart. Abandoned by the man that she loved and suffering complications from childbirth paired with starvation and/or hypothermia, Merope no longer had any desire to live, and made no attempts to utilize magic to save her own life. She couldn't even stay alive for her son? Dumbledore raised his eyebrows. Could you possibly be feeling sorry for Lord Voldemort? No, said Harry quickly. But she had a choice, didn't she? Not like my mother. Your mother had a choice too, said Dumbledore gently. Yes, Merope Riddle chose death in spite of a son who needed her. But do not judge her too harshly, Harry. She was greatly weakened by long suffering, and she never had your mother's courage. Merope's death meant that she was never there for Tom, and many believe that because of this, he grew up without any real concept or understanding of love, a condition some argue was a lasting consequence of the love potion she used on his father. And it's this apparent inability to feel love that is widely believed to have catalyzed Voldemort's descent into villainy. For many, the circumstances surrounding his parents and his birth suggest that Voldemort was, in some sense, destined for evil. However, in my opinion, this is one of the most misunderstood aspects of the story. The most common interpretation is that because he was born under a love potion, there exists no possibility for him to feel love or similar emotions. But this has actually been cleared up by J.K. Rowling in an interview. How much does the fact that Voldemort was conceived under a love potion have to do with his inability to understand love? Is it more symbolic? It was a symbolic way of showing that he came from a loveless union, but of course everything would have changed if Merope had survived and raised him herself and loved him. Either way, whether Voldemort fundamentally could or could not feel love, the fact remains that he never understood it, and that is almost impossible to dispute. And with his mother dead and his father long since gone, Tom was left completely alone, without family, guidance, or any real sense of belonging. In the heart of bustling London, tucked away in a forgotten corner, stood Wool's Orphanage, a desolate refuge where Tom Riddle spent the first 11.5 years of his life. The orphanage itself was described as a grim, square building surrounded by high railings, with stone stairs and a bare courtyard. Within the orphanage, Tom Riddle had a single room that contained an iron bedstead, an old wardrobe, and a hard wooden chair. The room's only decoration came from 7 stones sitting on a windowsill and a photo of a cliff on the wall. The creaking floorboards echoed with muffled sighs of longing, and each room held rows of narrow, discomforting beds, decorated only by thin blankets that hardly provided respite from the chill that seeped through the cracked walls. The truth is, Tom Riddle couldn't have been in an orphanage during a worse time period. The orphanage system in the UK only really began to take off in the 19th century, which meant that it was still very much in its infancy. Furthermore, 1926, the year Voldemort was born, was the very same year that the Child Adoption Act was passed in the UK, which finally made child adoption legal. During Tom Riddle's time there, the circumstances were nothing short of terrible. The aftermath of the First World War had left a surplus of war orphans, combined with programs aiming to remove street children from the grim city streets. This sudden influx of children easily overwhelmed the existing system, resulting in overcrowded facilities and a severe lack of resources. Many orphanages were unable to cope with the overwhelming demand and were forced to shut down or merge with others. The dire conditions led to scarce provisions, with it not being uncommon for multiple children to share a bed or sleep on the floor. Shoes were considered a luxury, and most orphans were lucky to have only 1 or 2 sets of clothes, one for winter and one for summer. Lack of nutritious food was a constant struggle, and orphans often subsisted on the same meagre and watered-down soup or porridge for weeks on end. Overworked caretakers, who were stretched thin and in many cases were neglectful or even abusive, added to the challenging atmosphere. To make matters worse, during this time many children as young as 12 were forced into labor, working grueling hours in docks and factories. With hygiene conditions deteriorating, diseases like diphtheria, cholera, and measles flourished. leaving malnourished children with weakened immune systems vulnerable to these illnesses. And as if the conditions were not already dire enough, in 1931, the Great Depression struck the United Kingdom, coinciding with Tom being just 5 years old. Orphanages lost a significant portion of their funding, exacerbating the scarcity of food and resources. The reality of death surrounded the young children, with illness and disease claiming the lives of those all around them, something that I feel further ingrained Tom's fear and obsession with mortality. In this grim and despairing environment, Tom Riddle was forced to endure, navigating a world where hope was a scarce commodity and the spectre of death loomed ever closer. Tom experienced firsthand the fragility of life. The constant presence of death, whether through diseases, malnourishment, or the loss of peers, reinforced his awareness of mortality from an early age. This heightened awareness of death and the transience of life left a lasting impact on Tom's psyche. But the most disturbing signs weren't just environmental, they were personal. In the books, it's revealed that even as a child, Tom Riddle had already begun to exert control over others in subtle but deeply unsettling ways. He would steal small personal possessions from the other children at Wall's orphanage, objects that held sentimental value, and keep them hidden away in what Dumbledore later described as a kind of trophy collection. These weren't random thefts. Each item was taken deliberately, often from children Tom had frightened, manipulated, or humiliated. And rather than discarding them, he kept these objects as souvenirs, tangible reminders of his power over others. By 1938, when Dumbledore first visited Tom, things had improved a little. Just 2 years prior, the Departmental Committee on Adoption Agencies had been appointed, and Dumbledore's description of the orphanage as shabby but spotlessly clean is a good indicator that things were moving in the right direction. But that doesn't take anything away from the fact that for the majority of his time at the orphanage, Tom Riddle lived in absolute squalor. This brings me to my first point. The environment of Wall's orphanage, combined with the harsh economic and social realities that surrounded Tom Riddle, left little room for the growth and development of positive emotional traits, such as love and compassion. The constant struggle for resources, lack of direction, and early exposure to hardship and loss made it impossible for Tom to find the emotional nourishment needed for healthy growth and development. Instead of love and compassion, Tom developed an overwhelming desire for power, control, and recognition. Conceived under a love potion, left behind by his mother, and growing up in this sort of environment meant that Tom Riddle never really had much of a chance. After beginning his studies at Hogwarts in 1938, Tom continually expressed a strong desire to avoid returning to Wall's orphanage for the summers, on one occasion even making a special request to the then headmaster, Armando Dippet, to remain in school during the holidays. And how could we blame him? After his very first year at Hogwarts, Tom returned to London during a time of heavy preparation for war. The city was in the process of building air raid shelters and readying anti-air guns and balloons, while the call for military service began. As summer neared its end, Tom discovered that not only he, but also the majority of London's child population, including his fellow orphans, were being evacuated to the countryside. Over 800,000 children had been relocated from the city by early September. On the day Tom left for Hogwarts in September, Germany invaded Poland, marking the beginning of World War II. The British Army mobilized, and 2 days later, the United Kingdom officially declared war on Germany. And when he returned to London at the end of his second year, he found the city in a state of panic. France had recently fallen, and the Battle of Britain had begun, with German and British fighter planes engaging in aerial combat. Rationing had commenced, air warning drills became a normal part of daily life, and on August 9th, the Birmingham Blitz commenced, which, although not directly affecting London, sent shockwaves throughout the entire United Kingdom. If we fast forward to the summer before his 7th year at Hogwarts, Tom would have bore witness to the first V1 missiles to hit London, which claimed the lives of over 6,000 people in a 12-day period. And though by this time Tom had already heavily descended into darkness, the catastrophic bombing of London by the Germans would have only further catalyzed Tom's jaded perspective on the world, and perhaps served as motivation for some of his more twisted world philosophies, such as the idea that there is no good or evil, only power, and those too weak to seek it. In an environment where the primary goal is survival, like the impoverished and desperate conditions faced by Tom, moral and ethical considerations tend to take a back seat. The immediate focus becomes ensuring basic needs like food and water are met, often trumping any concerns for the well-being of others. In situations like this, power becomes a critical factor. Those who possess power have control over resources, which means they have access to more food and essential items. The individuals who lack power or are deemed too weak are left to suffer and potentially starve. This is likely a contributing factor in Voldemort's growing obsession with achieving power. Furthermore, as the city faced relentless bombings and destruction, the constant threat of death pervaded the atmosphere. This only further magnified the fragility and impermanence of life, exacerbating Tom's obsession with his own mortality. The destruction and loss all around him intensified Tom's belief that life was fleeting and fragile. Seeing the consequences of war, the suffering inflicted upon innocent people, and the indiscriminate nature of death strengthened his resolve to transcend mortality. Desperate to assert control in the face of such destruction, he saw power as a means to protect himself from the horrors he witnessed, believing that if he gained enough control and influence, he could avoid the same fate that so many others suffered. Furthermore, in the 1920s, abuse in orphanages was not particularly uncommon. Through strict disciplinary measures, orphans would be subjected to physical punishment, including beatings, slapping, or other forms of physical violence. And this abuse, inflicted by harsh, authoritarian caretakers, would often result in physical injury or long-term psychological harm. In the case of Voldemort, it was the latter. By the time Dumbledore visited Tom at the orphanage, he was old enough and aware enough to make bad things happen to people. The caretakers and the other children were afraid of him. But Tom had been at the orphanage since he was an infant, which means that he may have been the target of abuse prior to him even being old enough to acknowledge it. He only endured it for as long as he remained out of touch with his magical ability. As an adult, Voldemort's ideology was founded on the notion that wizards were inherently superior to muggles, and they ought to exercise their power over them, an ideology that was unquestionably shaped by his difficult childhood experiences. Growing up in a war-torn environment at an abusive orphanage, Voldemort didn't exactly see the good side of muggles, and though he committed an unforgivable number of atrocities later in life, I can't imagine how young Tom Riddle could have ever really stood a chance. And yet, despite everything he endured at Wolves Orphanage, Tom Riddle did not emerge broken in the way many might expect. Instead, he emerged hardened, hyper-aware of hierarchy, control, and weakness. Survival had taught him an important lesson early on. Power was protection, and those who lacked it were destined to suffer. Hogwarts didn't change Tom Riddle. It simply gave him the tools and the environment to finally act on everything he had already learned. Upon his arrival at Hogwarts in 1938, Tom was unsurprisingly sorted into Slytherin House, and despite his dark nature, he had no issues forming connections. Tom may have lacked certain necessary human emotions, but that didn't mean he couldn't control people. His cunning and manipulative nature eventually meant that, in 1939, he would form a gang of sorts, a group consisting of his fellow Slytherin students. He had convinced these witches and wizards that he was their friend and gained their trust, but in reality Riddle had no desire for friends, and simply wanted to use them for his own selfish endeavours. The gang that Riddle formed was once described by Dumbledore, who worked at Hogwarts during this time, as a mixture of the weak seeking protection, the ambitious seeking glory, and the thuggish seeking a leader who could show them more refined cruelty. The gang's name at the time was the Knights of Walpurgis. The members, all from wealthy pureblood families, were involved in various unpleasant incidents during their school years. Despite this, Tom was careful never to be directly associated with any wrongdoing, and was perceived as an exemplary student. He first became a prefect in 1942 during his 5th year, and then, in 1944, during his 7th year, he became head boy. It was around this time that he eventually had to accept that his father was the Muggle and his mother the magical one, and from then on, Riddle adopted the alias Lord Voldemort to avoid any reminder of his filthy Muggle father. At this stage, it was evident that Dumbledore was the only person who saw through Tom's manipulative charm. Because of this, Dumbledore closely monitored Tom, and their relationship actually plays a crucial role in the First Wizarding War. During his 6th year at Hogwarts, Tom Riddle discussed the theoretical possibility of creating 6 Horcruxes with Professor Slughorn, shocking the professor with his interest in dark magic. This act marked Riddle's continued descent into darkness and pursuit of immortality through dark and forbidden magic. And so, in June of 1942, Voldemort began his journey of Horcrux creation. In that same year, Tom Riddle murdered Myrtle Warren in a Hogwarts bathroom, creating his first Horcrux by sealing a fragment of his soul inside his diary. This moment marked a turning point in Voldemort's history. It was his first deliberate act of murder, and the first time he fractured his soul. Then, in August of 1943, Tom Riddle travelled to Little Hangleton and murdered his father. Using a ring that had once belonged to his grandfather, Marvolo Gaunt, he created his second Horcrux. The creation of the ring Horcrux was especially significant because of its connection to his family. The ring was a Gaunt heirloom, one that tied Voldemort to his mother's bloodline and to the father who had abandoned him. This connection sparked Riddle's interest in his ancestry and ultimately led him back to Little Hangleton, where he encountered his uncle Morphin Gaunt, who was in possession of the ring. Riddle stole the ring, bewitched Morphin, and then travelled to his father's home, where he killed Tom Riddle Sr., transforming the ring into a Horcrux. Then, in 1945, Tom finally graduated from Hogwarts. Having finally completed his education, Riddle graduated and wasted no time in pursuing his next endeavour. Seizing the opportunity that presented itself with the retirement of Galatea Merrythought, Riddle swiftly applied for the vacant position of Defence Against the Dark Arts teacher at Hogwarts. Riddle saw this position not only as a chance to impart his knowledge of the dark arts, but also as a means to further establish his dominance within the wizarding community. However, Dumbledore, who had kept a watchful eye over Tom for a number of years, advised against hiring Riddle as a Hogwarts staff member. This resulted in Armando Dippet politely declining Riddle's application for the role, claiming that he was too young, but encouraged him to try again in the future. It was around the same time that Riddle became enthralled with the history of Hogwarts and its founders, particularly their relics. He used his cunning and charms to coerce the ghost of Helena Ravenclaw, the Grey Lady and daughter of Rowena Ravenclaw, to divulge the hiding place of her mother's diadem in a remote Albanian forest. Riddle then obtained the diadem and later killed an Albanian peasant, turning the object into his third Horcrux. Many people believe Voldemort's murder of the Albanian peasant was arbitrary, simply a case of wrong place, wrong time. But I'd argue that every Horcrux murder was deliberate and symbolic. And in this case, I believe the Albanian peasant's death was meaningful because it may have been the first time Voldemort used Nagini to commit murder. Canon tells us that Voldemort meets Nagini after his body is destroyed at the end of the First Wizarding War, but I don't think that's when their story actually begins. Voldemort is known to have travelled to Albania years earlier, and it's entirely possible, if not likely, that he encountered Nagini during this period, long before his initial downfall. This would explain why Voldemort later chose to return to Albania after his defeat. He already knew Nagini was there, and what better way to cement their bond than by using Nagini to kill the Albanian peasant, creating the Diadem Horcrux and marking the first time Nagini acted as an extension of Voldemort himself. When he returned to England, Riddle declined several job offers from the Ministry of Magic, instead taking a position at Borgin & Burke's in Knockturn Alley. It was there that he formed a calculated, one-sided relationship with Hepzibah Smith, a wealthy collector of magical artifacts. Exploiting her trust, Riddle gained access to two priceless heirlooms, Helga Hufflepuff's cup and Salazar Slytherin's locket. He later poisoned Hepzibah, framing her house elf for the crime, resigned from Borgin & Burke's and disappeared, using her murder, along with that of an unrelated muggle, to create his fourth and fifth Horcruxes. Years earlier, in a pensive memory omitted from the films, Caractacus Burke recalled an encounter with Merope Gaunt, who entered Borgin & Burke's destitute, malnourished, and barely able to stand. Desperate, she sold him Salazar Slytherin's locket, the last true Gaunt family heirloom, for a fraction of its value. That sale marked the severing of Voldemort's perceived birthright, and years later, by reclaiming the locket and stealing Hufflepuff's cup, Voldemort wasn't merely collecting powerful objects. He was reclaiming what he believed the world had denied him, transforming symbols of legacy and inheritance into anchors for his immortality. And following this murder, Voldemort disappeared for nearly a decade, from 1961 to 1971. During this period, he delved deep into the dark arts, studying obscure branches of magic and forging connections with loyal dark wizards. And by the time 1971 had rolled around, Voldemort re-emerged, having completely abandoned the name Tom Riddle and fully embraced the identity of Lord Voldemort. By this time, his presence alone instilled such fear across the wizarding world that many no longer dared speak his name, referring to him instead as he who must not be named, or you know who. But what's striking is how much of that transformation, the decisions, the losses, and the moments that shaped him, never made it onto the screen. So why were so many of these moments left out of the films? Unfortunately, the simplest and lamest answer is time. The Harry Potter films are already tasked with adapting massive books and maintaining pacing for a general audience. Voldemort's backstory, especially in The Half-Blood Prince, is told largely through extended pensive memories, conversations, and slow revelations. Translating all of that to screen would have required significant runtime with very little forward momentum. There's also the fact that Voldemort's true origins aren't just dark, they're deeply uncomfortable. They deal with abuse, neglect, obsession, manipulation, and generational decay. And including all of this would have forced the audience to confront the idea that Voldemort wasn't simply evil incarnate, but a product of cruelty, neglect, and conscious choices made over a lifetime. Filmmakers instead chose to make Voldemort more mythic, more distant. By stripping away the messy human details, he becomes a symbol of evil, rather than a case study in how it forms. And that was really the unfortunate trade-off. Yeah, cutting these scenes streamlined the story, but they also removed the connective tissue that explains why Voldemort became who he did. The books never ask us to sympathize with him, but they do ask us to understand him. And by removing all of these key aspects of his history, I just don't think that's possible. And that's it for today's video. What do you think? Should filmmakers have included more of these pensive memories? Of all of the spin-offs that could be made, I think a Voldemort origin story tops the list, at least for me. If you enjoy the content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, remember, it does not do to dwell on dreams and forget to live.